in all the years of doing transformation, we learned very early on to get a very good understanding of the cash equation in the business, because nothing will halt attempts at improvement more than not having enough cash to pay the bills next week.
Welcome to the Leadership Podcast. With me is Matt Sims. I'm Kyle Racky. We're going to be talking about cash flow today in small businesses. Is it when you have technician founders, technician-run businesses? A lot of times they're sort of, giving it to the accountants and the bookkeepers and not really paying close attention to it. And just, I remember my friend Andrew, who runs an agency business, and I was trying to, get him on KPIs and tracking, projects and even just tracking time. And I said, like, how do you do it today? He goes, well, my accountant tells me at the end of the month if I have money in my account. And I shook my head at him. But, this is surprisingly common. You'd think a business owner would be more like paying attention to the cash flow.
No, it's the classic work hard and hope it works. And that's not a great strategy for cash flow. And, there's nothing more paralyzing than, do I have enough cash in the bank? And am I going to have enough cash in the bank? And there are so many small businesses that are a couple missed payments away from it being all over. So in all the years of doing transformation, we learned very early on to get a very good understanding of the cash equation in the business, because nothing will halt attempts at improvement more than not having enough cash to pay the bills next week. I worked with one woman actually in the occupational therapy business, where every second Thursday she would open a bottle of shitty red wine. She would pour a glass, have it. She would pour a second glass, and she would open her bank account and hope there was enough money in there. And if there wasn't, she knew she was going to have to make one of those terrible calls to either the bank to beg them for a little bit more, or to her father, which she hated making that call to her father, to borrow a little bit from his retirement to be able to make. And the problem actually wasn't profitability of the business. And this is what kills small business owners. They're busy and they're doing a lot of work that brings revenue, but that revenue turning into cash is a different conversation altogether. And too many people confuse the cash flow run rate, the operational cash flow run rate of a business with the amount of cash they have in the bank. And sometimes they have, loans and access to credit lines and all that kind of stuff. And the bigger your business becomes, the less connected the financials are to the weekly run rate. And this is really hard for technicians, because in the beginning, there's only a certain number of them. And the profit and loss statement could basically be a cash flow pro forma too. But then the bigger you get and the more complex you get and the more you have to pay out in payroll and the longer your receivables are, the more fog gets in there. And look, you didn't go to school to be an accountant. You went to school to be a vet. You went to school to be a physio. You went to school to be an accountant. You went to school to be a marketer. You do those technical jobs, and then you turn around and go, do I have enough money?
I can relate to this just even in my business, which is software subscriptions, because thankfully I have a really great CFO who, does this for me and walks me through it every month. And, it's just amazing how you sell like an annual subscription to something. And because of the way the accounting rules, GAAP accounting is like, well, you're only allocating the monthly revenue to that. Right. So even though you might get a big cash injection for 12 months, it's not actually showing in your top line, revenue. So all these businesses are different. And like the agency business I used to run was that very small, not very well run business where, I remember Kevin, my business partner, would sometimes have to jump in the car and drive 3 hours to pick up a check from a client just so we could make payroll. And there was so many close calls where, we couldn't pay ourselves, but we could just enough to pay our staff, and it's not a fun place to be.
No, and it's a place where, look, that's a very common situation for small business owners, unfortunately. And it's because they don't understand how does it become cash. And so whenever we work with small businesses, the very first thing is to make sure that the cash equation is solid. And the interesting thing about the cash equation is it changes as you scale. And so you've got to learn new ways of managing it as it gets bigger. And you really have to make sure that you're bringing in enough cash per week. Classic story in with that occupational therapist. The very first project we did for them was around accounts receivable.
Because that was the biggest problem.
It was the biggest problem. And what was interesting is it wasn't actually getting the receivable. So they had an invoicing process. This is hilarious. This is where I say blame how, not who, because they had an invoicing process where the front desk would do the invoicing. The invoices to be sent out, she didn't realize how important they were. It was another one of 100 tasks she had that day. And when they would put a new file to be invoiced, all the invoice files were actually alphabetical. Okay, so that meant that if your last name was T or below that in the alphabet, it could be 180 days before the invoice got sent out.
Wow. So you want to have a last name Zed.
With that business at that time. But what we did, it was a very simple process where we said all invoices go out every day. So the front desk went, well, how am I going to do that with everything else? And the business owner actually said, look, I will sit at the front desk. You go into the office for an hour and send all the invoices. So we'll switch positions. And at first it took an hour. Then it took 30 minutes. Then once she understood how important it was, she was doing it, and every minute of downtime she had, it ended up, it was like 5 to 15 minutes at the end of the day. And it was just a shift in where does this fall with all the other stuff I need to do? Where does this fall? Well, it falls pretty high. Get it done every day. We won't leave until it's done. And so that was the first thing we did. And people go, well, that's not real money. I was going to get that money anyway. Well, if you know anything about business, you know that if you shift $100,000 of cash 90 days to the left, so you get it 90 days faster, that's a real $100,000 that you have in your business to pay your payroll, invest in improvements, all that kind of fun stuff.
Not even just have the mental drain of it. Be able to focus on your business without worrying about paying your rent or your payroll.
There are so many secondary and tertiary benefits to having that cash in the bank, but there's real cash benefits too. Like if you have a line of credit and you're $100,000 into your line of credit and you're consistently $100,000 for a year, but you bring $100,000 back, if you have 5 to 7% you're paying on that, you just saved yourself $5,000 to $7,000 of real dollars in a year. And you also have access to that cash to do stuff with. Like it's why it's almost, it's so difficult to help technicians understand the value of collecting AR, because what they want to do is they want to do the work, right? So how do you put these processes in place to make sure that you have the cash?
And probably get someone else doing it, because when I ran an agency, I was the technician doing the work, but I also did all the invoicing because I felt like I was the only one who could do it right. Like I knew all the work that was going on and how much we needed to charge. I didn't want to like sub that out to a bookkeeper. And I also felt like they wouldn't have the same sense of urgency that I would. I think this story kind of confirms that. But it was just a process problem.
It's just a process issue. And if your proposals or contracts or invoices are so complex that you need to do it, you probably need to look at those. Like this is a very simple thing to get standardized. This is a very simple thing to have working for you. And we, like when I own a sign company, we moved from collecting the money at the end of the job to we don't start your job till you put a 50% deposit down. So there are ways, even when you're collecting AR in time, there are really good ways to actually go, no, we're going to move this way up, right? Like we booked a podcasting studio here today. Are they going to invoice us at the end of this and we'll pay over here? Or are they not letting us into the studio until we pay? If I'm running their business, I wouldn't let them in the studio till they paid. So I don't have to chase the money.
Free tip. There you go.
Yeah. But I don't want to chase the money.
Right.
Yeah. Especially like we're in here for the first time. So a client coming in for the first time, what happens if it takes him? What happens if we never pay? He's got to chase us. He's got to do something else. Like, how does he know whether we're going to pay or not, right? First time clients for me, you pay before you come in. So there are lots of things you can do on AR. And now I know I'm going to have to pay the bill before we leave here, but there are lots of things you can do on AR that actually turn cash to where you get it before you do the work. Now that's a whole other dangerous issue, because just as you talked about in the SaaS thing, you got this big bank account, but it's not actually your return because the expenses to deliver that are going to happen over the next 12 months. So either way of the coin, but I'd rather have the cash in my bank account and deal with it than not.
Quick story here. So we had a client, which was a university, and we were doing this big software project for them. And having had at that point 5 years in business of those scars of having to pick up checks and worrying about cash flow, we were very clear on monthly payments. So it's like, here's a big project, and we think it's going to take about 6 to 8 months or whatever it was, and we've broken it into monthly payments. So basically, like every month we get paid, as opposed to milestone based, which we used to do. But unfortunately, the milestones were so dependent on the client that if they dragged their feet, we'd never get paid. So, but this university and this department within the university was all academics. I know you don't know what those are like. They're so slow moving that we didn't even really start the project for 8 months, but we were still getting paid for it. And that was a big problem for us because we were here getting, I loved getting this big giant check in the mail every month for work we didn't do, but I knew eventually we were going to have to do it. And at that point, it's coming out of next year's expenses.
Yeah, that's a huge problem when you're an agency. You have a certain amount of salaries, you're paying them, you have jobs, but you can't deploy them on it, and you're constantly waiting for them to come. We run into that in our transformation work all the time, right? Where they've paid for the work, but we also have a run rate of salaries we have to pay. We don't just pay the salaries when we do the work. So you really have to watch, how does this all come together, and make sure on either side of it you don't get caught. And there are good bookkeepers and controllers, and depending on the size of your organization, if you're over $1 million, you need your own internal bookkeeper / controller. Keeping your financial house in order is probably the single most important thing you can do for CRA, for the banks, for understanding how does it connect, and then you can understand
That's
your
our
bank
IRS,
account.
By the way, for any American listeners.
Oh yeah, yeah. CRA, IRS, yeah. I keep hammering this point around cash because nothing, we all have a fight or flight response, and nothing will paralyze you more than worry about cash. It just takes you away from growing the business, working with your people. You show up in a different way. You're not able to support your teams. You're not able to sell properly. When you go to sell, there's an air of desperation. It just has such a set of ugly cascading effects on you and the business that you want to get ahead of this. And this comes from viscerally living this, and this comes from helping a number of organizations get out of the rat race on that and get to where they have a nice, steady, solid bank account that they can then start to make. It frees them up to make decisions.
Financial health is so sometimes undervalued or underinvested in. You'd be amazed. We were, I think, even a 10 million a year business, and it would take sometimes to over 2, sometimes 3 months just to get monthly financial statements because the systems weren't in place for it. With having Kathy in the CFO role now for a couple of years, like we've got it down to days after month's end, you get fully baked financial statements.
Every one of our businesses between 3 and 7 days at month end, we have a full review as if it was a year-end review. So that what ends up happening is when you go to do your year end, there's very little true up so that you have a really good, accurate picture. And my partner and I, we review simplicities, and with other partners, we review that monthly.
Yeah. So for cash flow, you talked, that was a great story that you told about the invoicing system and, getting out of doing it sort of in a weird haphazard way and creating more of a daily system around it that got it done. But what other tips would you have for business owners around getting, more cash in the door or figuring out cash flow systems?
Yeah. So a couple things. One, the bank, when you need it, the bank's never going to give it to you. And when you don't need it, the bank's willing to give it to you. So always go to the bank when you don't need it, because I always want you to have as much buffer as possible. So whatever type of credit line they're willing to extend to you, get it. Doesn't mean use it. It means get it when you don't need it. So that's one tip that I always tell business owners. Get access to as much affordable capital as you can. Now, keep it in reserve. The other thing I would say is look at your pricing. Too often, people don't use that lever at all in strategy, and it's probably the simplest and fastest route to increasing your cash per week. The other thing is, do you understand how your business produces cash? So what's an hour worth? How many hours do you have to do to cover costs, right? I'm working with a physiotherapy company right now, and once they have 3 full-time physios running, the gross margin off of that covers their overhead. So the 4th one starts to put cash in the bank. The 5th one even more. There's a compounding impact to that. So we've got 16 in there now. It's a really nice business, but we knew, where's your break even? So if you're going to run cash flow effectively, do you know your break even? Do you know that you have enough in the bank, enough work that you're going to do this month, or enough predictable work that's going to come in that you're going to be fine? Right? Just looking at the different ways cash is produced and making sure you're maximizing all of them, right? So we talked about the one invoicing bit. We talked about making sure look, the one that's not fun is chasing money. But at the end of the day, if you have ARs, remember your AR is someone else's AP. And they are consistently trying to delay as long as they can, and you're trying to collect as fast as you can. So that's the world we live in. And sometimes it's intentional. There are some big companies that will intentionally go 90, 120 days because they'll just look at you and smile and go, what are you going to do?
Yeah. Or Walmart, 6 months, I believe, is there.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's insane, right? Walmart actually makes a tremendous amount of money off of the money they don't pay the suppliers.
Because of the interest.
The interest that they drive, right? How much longer can they keep the cash in the bank? Right. So these are games that bigger companies have figured out how to play. So if you're working with a lot of bigger companies, watch out for that. You talked about the universities. Look, it's hard to find a person on campus in July and August. So if you have a contract that runs through that, how are you going to mitigate getting paid in heavy vacation season? The worst one for this is actually not summer. It's around Christmas. Because the 2 weeks leading up to Christmas and the 2 weeks after, that is a time where people in large businesses you're an invoice number to somebody in an accounts payable department. You know, the other game that people play is they pretend that you didn't give them the full information on their invoice and all that fun stuff. You got to send it back, and then they only pay on the 30th of the month. So this becomes, know who you're dealing with and how they pay, and are you making sure to optimize how you're getting paid? I mean, during COVID, the governments did a wonderful thing, and at least in New Brunswick, and they started paying on Net 15 to help all the small businesses. And they've actually kept that up. And that was a lifesaver for a number of businesses that I worked with during COVID. Right? So what are the people you're working for? How do they pay? And do you know how that factors into your cash equation? You need to know that because you only have influence over it. You don't have control.
Awesome tips. Hope people found this super valuable. I know I did. So if people want to check out the leadership program, or where they can, where you guys dig into some of this during the 12-month cohort-based program, that's if you're struggling with cash flow and the feast and famine type of business, which I know I've run that business before. That's one of the benefits that the leadership program can offer. So people should go to leadership.com, check that out, and apply to be in the next cohort. So until next time, we're going to cover more of these types of topics in the future, but bye for now.